of the House, in particular the Chair, Nicky Wagner. Thank you.
Good speech. Good speech.
Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Mr Speaker, I'd like to begin my contribution on the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Bill. Have I got any time left? It's a long name on this bill. By reiterating the points that the member who's just resumed his seat concluded with, and that is to acknowledge all the members of the Select Committee who have examined this bill and the officials who worked pretty rigorously to try and make improvements. But unfortunately they weren't able to make enough improvements for us to support the bill, and that's a huge regret to me. I'm really sorry that on an area where legislation was clearly needed, where all parties throughout the House, I understand even the ACT Party, have identified that there is a gap in our legislative framework. We didn't have environmental protections and also the security for work to be done in the EEZ without any huge litigation. We didn't have that regime in place as we do on land with the RMA, and yet here was the opportunity for that legislation to fill that vacuum, and it was found fundamentally flawed. The reason for that, Mr Speaker, was because in the purpose clause, which is set out on page 19, I think, of the legislation, rather than setting out what would meet our international obligations, and what in my view is not only a legal but moral responsibility of a government to ensure as a primary focus the protection of our environment, this bill does that old National Party trick, which is to talk about providing a balance. That's right. Well, actually, that's not what a protective regime is about. A protective regime is saying something has to come first, and for us, it's the environment. We want economic activity, as the member for Auckland Central has indicated. We're supportive of that, but not at the cost of our environment, because you only have one chance. And some things cannot be repaired, some things cannot be returned to the way they are, and therefore you have a regime in place which says, yes, we want economic activity, but we will not do it to the detriment of our environment. That comes first, and this legislation gives that opportunity away. So it's with some sadness that I say, Mr Speaker, we can't support this bill. What a delight it would be to have every party in Parliament giving a clear message to people who want to have economic development in the EEZ, and those, I guess all of us, who seek to ensure that that special environment is protected. What a wonderful thing it would be for every party in Parliament to say this is the way to do it and support it. But instead, despite huge efforts of the various parties, and I want to acknowledge Andrew Williams, who's just resumed his seat, and I've heard Eugenie Sage speak on this bill, as well as my parliamentary Labour colleagues. I want to acknowledge their hard work in trying to get some genuine progress made so that we could offer support to this bill as it progresses. I'm sure that the environmental groups who have today made a letter to the current Minister for the Environment, Amy Adams, made that letter public. I'm sure they feel a deep sadness as well. This is an opportunity lost. So today the Environmental Defence Society, Forest and Bird, WWF New Zealand and Ecologic have released an open letter expressing their sadness. They have even said that they have proposed alternative wording for the bill to the Minister, which would mean they could celebrate and support its progress. But for some reason, the Minister said no, and I don't understand it. Perhaps she has not yet got the confidence in her new portfolio that she had in previous ones. The Forest and Bird Conservation Advocate, Claire Browning, actually said in the release that accompanied their open letter, we are not opposed to economic development in our EEZ, provided we have in place economic legislation that will properly manage the environmental effects and risks associated with those activities, especially in our deep oceans. Who could argue with that? Well, it sounds like every single member of the National Party, and perhaps even John Banks, who I know has a strong commitment to environmental protection as well as economic development, and understands that you can't just trade off one for the other, that some things are beyond repair once they're damaged, and those are the other things that we have a responsibility to protect. Mr Speaker, when I read through the letter that I just referred to from the Environmental Defence Society, from Forest and Bird, from WWF and Ecologic, it was with a lot of sadness, because those organisations all made submissions to the bill. They didn't come along and say, we oppose everything, as the National Party has portrayed them. They didn't come along and say, we don't care about unemployment because we're so anti-development, as the National Party has portrayed them. That's not the submissions that they made to the Select Committee. They submitted to the Select Committee that not only did they understand economic development in these areas, but they supported it, but it had to be after the environmental protection regime was in place. I heard the Minister, and in fact some members, refer to the international obligations we had, and the Minister was quite dismissive actually, and basically said, well, if a bunch of fringe tree huggers want to come along and say we don't comply with international obligations, I as a lawyer, this was the Minister speaking, sorry, I don't want to imply that I'm a lawyer, heaven forbid. The Minister said, I as a lawyer don't agree with them. She, apologies to one of your professions, Honourable Chester Burrows. But Mr Speaker, it wasn't, it wasn't any fringe or extreme groups at all who said that under this legislation we will fail to comply with our international obligations. It was the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, amongst many others, who quoted the Convention of the Law of the Sea. She said, this is what it says: states have the sovereign right to exploit their natural resources pursuant to their environmental policies and in accordance with their duty to protect and preserve the marine environment. It's not a balance. The protection, the duty of protection of the marine environment is paramount. It must come first. It must be in the purpose clause of this legislation, and it isn't. And then we had, and I suppose the Honourable Amy Adams will dismiss this fringe tree-hugging group as well, a group called the New Zealand Law Society, who came along to the, and I noticed my colleague Charles Chauvel inclining his head at the mention of their name. They came along and said in their submission, the right to develop resources within the EEZ and on the continental shelf conferred under the LOSC and customary international law is subject to obligations to protect and preserve the marine environment. And Mr Speaker, I'll draw your attention to the specific words, subject to obligations to protect and preserve the marine environment. This is not a balancing act. This is not a situation where some organisation will come along and say we want to work, we want to extract, we want to put in place any economic activity in the EEZ or on the continental shelf, and perhaps in return we could make a sizable donation, we could buy some land, we could expand a national park. This is not a balancing act, this is not a trade-off, this is our moral and legal duty and obligation to preserve the environment. That's what we signed up to, Mr Speaker, and that's where this bill fails. So the purpose clause of the bill is wrong, and had the Minister listened to the submitters and the urges of other parties in this regard, we would have supported amending the purpose clause, consequential amendments throughout the bill, and we would have then been very happy to support it, because, as I said at the beginning of my contribution, the lack of protection of the environment in the EEZ and the continental shelf, and the lack of security and confidence, the lack of a regulatory regime for those who wish to have economic development activities in this area, is a failing. It is a shortfall. We should have both. We should ensure that people who want to have economic development in this area know the rules, know that if they proceed along X, Y and Z grounds, they'll be fine. They'll be able to do that work without any litigation. It won't cost them a lot in court fees and arguments. They'll know the regulatory regime. But, Mr Speaker, most of all, we have to have the environmental protections put in place. So the purpose clause remains as it is, and therefore Labor as we did right at the very beginning of this process, said that we were the only party that said that from the outset. We said we want this legislation to be in place, but it's flawed to the point of us being able to do that. There is a vacuum in our legislative regime. We would like to have filled it with legislation that did understand our legal and moral obligations to protect the environment first, that did understand that, unlike the National Party, we don't think of it as a balancing act, as a trading off. We know that some things once damaged can't be repaired, and that is too high a price for us to pay. We had the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, we had the Law Society, we had local authorities, we had iwi, we had environmental groups, we had the spectrum of people interested in this issue, and overwhelmingly submitters expressed their great sorrow and concern that this bill just does not cut the mustard.
Maggie Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is with great pleasure that